Hey, welcome back. If you're just joining us, we are on lesson 2 of this series. And last time, all we did was set everything up. If you're interested in that, you can grab all the code in the link in the description. Just go ahead and make sure you download the code for lesson 1, and then you'll be set to go for lesson 2 here. Now, once you've got everything ready, you can just do npm I, and that will install everything if you haven't been following along. Otherwise, you can do npm run dev. All right, so now that I've got this dev server running over here on localhost 3000, I should be able to come over here and refresh, and there we go. Hi, I am dynamic. We set up some customizations last time for Tailwind, but we have yet to build anything out. So let's go ahead and start, and we're going to start, this is kind of the finished code here, with this top area that has a link, and then we'll have this H1, this button, and we'll also do this section right here, what dreams are made of. Now, we're not going to do any of the Parallax stuff for now. We'll save that till later on in the series, but let's go ahead and start working on this. Now, the way Vite sets everything up to start with is it imports everything through this JavaScript file and dumps everything into this app div. But we don't need this app div. I also don't want that H1. Let me also come over here and we'll open up this main.js file, and I can go ahead and delete all of this. We will leave that style import because that's how our CSS is getting to our HTML here. So I'll save both of those, come back over here, and now it should just be a blank page, which is perfect. Okay, so for this first section, we've got several things we need to think about. First of all, we've got this is going to be a nav area up here. It's only got one item in it, but it is technically navigation, so we'll make sure to add that. We also want to set some default styling. So if I come in here and select, you'll notice that I've got a different kind of selection than the normal one in the browser. And then we'll also set up a header where we'll add all of this. Okay, so let's kind of start with that default styling. So if I come over here, what we can do is say selection. And this pseudo selector, you can see the IntelliSense here, is telling me, will give me access to any time I select any text on the page. And all I want to do is set it to my background of accent. We set up that custom color last time. And then when I have selection, I also want to take the text and set that to my text of background. Finally, I'm going to set this to overflow hidden, and those will kind of be my default styles for the body. If I save that and come back over this way, you can see that nothing much has changed, but if I were to have text, and you'll see that in a second, and I select it, now these should work properly. Now, everything else here inside the body is actually going to be wrapped inside of one div that we're going to use to set up that kind of parallax effect. So for now, I'm just going to have a div here. We won't have anything. Maybe let's just call this like parallax so we remember to come back to it. But everything will be wrapped inside of this, and everything will basically be responsive based off of this. For now, though, we're not going to worry too much about that. Up top, though, we will go ahead and create a nav. And then let's add some classes to this. And again, Tailwind is going to pick these up. Now, if you haven't worked with Tailwind, I've just been kind of typing these classes, and it might seem a little mysterious for you. A couple things that will help you. Number one, their documentation is really good. So if you come over here, anytime you're on their docs and you hit Command K, you can search for anything. So for instance, I could search for like background color. And you can see it gives me all these different options, background size, keep typing, color. There we go. Okay, so now I've got all these different options that I can use, and it shows you how to do it, how to customize it down below. So their documentation is really helpful to follow. I also know that Sean has done several series on Tailwind itself. I've also done a single video on it explaining it, building out a landing page, very much like we're going to do today, but I went into more detail about kind of how to learn how to use Tailwind. Now, because I've got this IntelliSense plugin that I showed you last time, you can see right here, it's this Tailwind CSS IntelliSense. Because I've got that, I actually don't have to go look up a bunch of stuff in the docs. It actually previews it for me in the code editor, so that will speed us up a little bit. But we will reference the documentation every now and then. Let's get our Vite app back up and running over this way, and let's go ahead and start adding some classes. The first one I'm wanting is grid, and you can see there in the IntelliSense that says it will apply a display of grid to this. That's what I want. Next, I want place items, and you can see here that what I'm wanting is the center, so that will put everything in the very middle. Now, if we go back to the finalized code, you're going to see here that at the very top, this is going to stay stuck to the top. Everything else is kind of responsive, but technically this is actually over everything as a positioned absolute element. So let's do that here. So we'll say absolute. That makes it position absolute. Width full makes it stretch all the way across. Make sure it stays to the top, and then we'll give it a Z index of 50 so it stays above all the rest of the content. Now, I'll actually have a nav bar below in the footer as well. So let's come in here and say this needs to have an ARIA label here. We'll call this something like primary navigation. The one in the footer then can say like footer navigation. Inside here, we're just going to have one thing, and that will be a link, and that will point just to the home page. And then inside here, we're going to have an SVG. And because it will just be a picture, let's go ahead and just update the ARIA label here. So this tells assistive technology essentially that this points back to our home page. So we'll say go home or something like that. Now in this case, we only have a single page, but you can imagine for a multi-page site how helpful that might be. Next, let's add some classes here. We'll want padding around the SVG, and we will also want some margin. So padding of 1, margin of 4, which gives me 16 pixels all the way around. We'll add some more to that in just a second, but for now, let's go ahead and open up the sidebar, and let's go in here and look at our images. What we're interested in is this SVG, and I'll just copy all this out. Let's jump down here, close the sidebar, and drop it in right here. All right, so by adding it directly in here, one of the things that's going to help us with is it will load really quickly because it doesn't have to go fetch it. Now, I actually do want to add some classes to this as well. So let's say class, and this is just inside this opening SVG tag. Let's add a couple of classes just for the width. So we'll say by default, it should be a width of 32. And then we'll say on small screen sizes, so this is a media query, and that's how you declare them in Tailwind. We'll say colon width 48, so 192 pixels. Next, we'll say on large viewports, it should be width of 56. You can see there that's 224 pixels. So as I expand this viewport, that should actually increase in size, and that's what it does. Now I clean up this code a little bit. Let's go ahead and just collapse this SVG so that we don't have to have such a long tag there, and I'll move this in as well. If I come over here and refresh, you can see there it is right in the middle. Now if I go ahead and hit tab, it'll select it, but by default, that's kind of an ugly selection, so we can actually customize that experience if we want. So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing I'm going to do is say that on focus, it should be outline none. Now that means if I actually tab to it, you can't see anything even though I'm selecting it. So that's no good if that's all you do. You actually need to come in now and provide your own. So we'll say focus visible. So whenever it's actually being tabbed to, then we want a ring of 4. Now rings in Tailwind are box shadows, and it's selecting that there. Now if I come over here and tab to it, I get this default color in Tailwind of this kind of blue color, but I can customize that if I want to. So I can say ring background, and it will give me that ring background color. Now in this case, because my background is already there, you can't see anything, so we'll have to update that in a second. So for now, let's just set it to accent so you can actually see what's going on. And then we're going to add a couple of other things. So we'll say rounded full, like that, and that way we've got a nice rounded outline on that. The last thing I'll add here is a transition, and there's several default transitions. Because it's a box shadow, I'm going to just transition on the shadow, and that means if I come in here and focus on it, it just nicely slides in. If I unfocus, same kind of thing. You can change the duration and things like that as well, but we'll leave it just like that right now. Okay, so we're going to call that done for our navigation. Let's go ahead and clean this up just a touch, and then because we're done, let's collapse it. And we'll come down here. The next section we're going to add is a header tag. Now this header is going to give us a chance to play around with a couple of other things. The first thing though is let's go ahead and add some default classes to this. So I want it to have a min height of screen, so that will take up the full view height. I want it to be flex, which is display flex, and then flex col, which changes it to flex of column. Now that I've changed that flex axis, I can say justify evenly, and it will justify everything that we're going to put in here evenly. And then I want the items to the center, which places all the things left and right centered since we've changed that axis around. Finally, I'm going to have some position absolute things in here. So let's say position relative, so that everything will be relative to this parent container. Now we're going to have 3 normally positioned elements inside of here. So let's go ahead and add those one after the other. First of all, I'm going to have an image. Then I'm going to have an H1, and then finally I'm going to have a link for that button. So if I come back up to my image here and I open up my sidebar, you can see here that I've got several hero images, and basically I want to load the right one depending on the viewport width. So this is the largest one, this is the next largest, medium small, and then extra small. I don't want to load a larger image than I need to. Now, of course, you could also add like WebP or AVIF, other formats in here as well, but just to keep it simple, I've kept these to all JPEGs. So what I'll do first of all is point this to the default image. So we'll say images hero.jpg. Now this will be the background image, and I'm actually going to hide it by default, so I don't need an alt tag only because I'm going to hide it. Other than that, you always need an alt tag. So I'll say aria hidden, and this equals true. So with that set, let's come over here, and the next thing we're going to do is add some classes. So I'll say class, and then here we want this to be position absolute, and I forgot this one actually is absolute, unlike the other two that we typed out below. And we want this to be height full and width full, and then we want it to be behind everything else so we can do a negative Z index. Let's just do something like 20. We're not going to have a lot of negative Z indexed items. Now if I go ahead and save this, it should populate, and that's what we want it to be, but you can see it's kind of stretched, so we can change that with object fit. And so let's first of all set the object fit to cover, and then to make sure it's positioned in the center, we'll say object center. And you can see that sets the object position to center. If I save it here again, now it kind of stretches out as we'd want. Again, this is great, but this is going to load a massive image even on small phones. So what we want to do is give it a different series of items that the browser can choose between to decide essentially which might be most useful in any given circumstance. So I'm going to come up here, and there's two other properties we can add here. First of all, I can add a sizes, and then secondly, I can add a src set. Now what I can do is give it a series of sizes, and then I can give it a series of images, and let the browser essentially decide which one it should load. So let's come over here to our sizes first, and I'm going to first of all give it a media query. I'll say min width of 500 pixels, and then I'm going to give it several different options based on the viewport width. I'll say 480, and then I'll just give it a W for width, so not VW or anything like that, it's just a W, and then 650 W, 800 W, and finally 1300 W. Then I can give it a series of images, and I'll start with the smallest one first. So I'll say images, hero, x small, JPEG, and then I'll actually tie it to one of the viewport widths up above. So I'll say 480 width. And that tells it, hey, associate this with this up here. Now, just like up above with the sizes, I separate these with commas as well. So let me go ahead and add in the other options we have. All right, so you can see here I have now a hero small set to that 650, hero medium set to the 800, and then hero large set to the 1300. If I come over here and I inspect, and let's pull this over and look at the network itself, and we'll just limit ourselves to this image. If I go ahead and refresh here, you can see it's pulling in this image. And let's see, let's close this back out. You can see here it's 145 bytes. Now, if I get a lot smaller, let's actually get down to this 320 and refresh again. Let's see, it should be pulling in a smaller one. Let's get a little bit smaller. Let's get it larger. Okay, so it's the same image every single time. So that tells me that we did something wrong. Well, let's figure it out. If I come back over this way, all right, and as I'm looking at this, I'm not seeing anything overtly wrong. So maybe let's come back, this way. Okay, so maybe I just had to refresh there because now I'm getting hero large. Let's disable cache though, just to make sure it's pulling in a new image each time, and then I'll save the game. Okay, so there you go. So now it's 101 kilobytes. If I get a little bit larger, it'll now decide, and even as I pull, you see how that actually changes automatically. So it starts with small, it gets a little bit larger, it pulls in the next one, a little bit larger, and it pulls in the next one. So now the browser gets to decide essentially what kind of image it pulls in. All right, so that's set and ready to go. Let's next come in here to our H1. For here, we're just going to say unique trips for adventurous travelers. And no matter what screen size, I actually want it to break just like this. So I can just add these BR tags and it will break for me automatically. So if I save this, there it goes. It's kind of small, but we can change that here with some classes. So let's come in here and we'll say text 5XL. And then we'll also say text center font bold. And these are just Tailwind classes to center to change the font weight to bold. And then we'll set the text to white. We'll give it tracking of wide. This will make sure that the letter spacing is spaced out a bit, as you can see there. And then finally, we'll add some padding up and down, which you can do with padding Y. So for the Y axis, we'll do 12, which is 3 rem. So I'll go ahead and save that there. And now it expands out quite a bit. Now you can see that that text is a little bit hard to read, and it's because it's sitting directly on the image. So we're going to do a couple things to fix that, but let's come back to that in just a second. And first of all, finish out our button below. This will eventually point to an ID of contact form, which does not yet exist. We'll get that in a second. And this will have two things. It'll have some text, and we'll also have an SVG inside of that text. So let's put the text inside of a span. And here I'm just going to do span with a dot here using emmet, which comes default installed in VS Code. I can just add the classes directly in here. So I'll say uppercase, and then I also want dot tracking wide. So again, I want that to be spaced out, the letter spacing a little bit different. I can also come in here and in curly brackets, add book a trip, and it will respect that. When I hit enter, everything just expands out, which is kind of nice. So if I save that, there it is down here, book a trip. All right, so let's go ahead and add some custom classes to this, and maybe let's come in here just to make it a little bit easier to read. We're going to have lots of different things because this is our main kind of button section. First of all, I know I'm going to want it to have my background of accent, and then let's go ahead and change up the font as well. So that would be text background. I want this to take up just slightly thicker font, so we'll say font medium, and that's going to give me my 500 weight. And then we'll give it some padding up and down of 3, padding left and right of 8. I do want this to be rounded all the way, so I'll say rounded full, and that will make it a pill shape. We'll add a border on here as well, and then change the border color to border of background, which is that dark custom color I set up. Now, just like we did up top, when I come in here and I tab to it, this first one looks great. This second one, not so much. So let's customize that experience. So if I come inside here, first of all, I'm going to say focus. On focus, I want this to be outline of none. And again, if you remove that outline, you better add something else so people can actually see it when they focus. So I'll say focus visible. I want there to be a ring of 4. This will be very much like we did up above. I want that color of the ring to be ring accent. And if I save that there and come in here now, a lot of that should be different. So there it is right here. Let's go ahead and change the inner color of that ring. You can have kind of 2 colors, the outside color and the inside color. And by default, I forget what it chooses for that inside color, but we can set that with ring offset, and then we'll give it a color of background. I actually want it to be moved a little bit away from the button, and you can do that with another class called ring offset. And you can give it a different number, so like 0 right there, 1, 2, 4, or 8. Let's choose 2. And if I save that and come back over this way and move to it, you can see now it's moved a little bit away, and that inner color is my ring offset background. All right, that is mostly there. Let's come back over here though, and when I hover, I actually want to change the state a little bit as well, just to show that I'm hovering, aside from the cursor changing. So let's change something on there as well. So back in our button over here, we'll say on hover, we want the background to go to accent, and we'll do /90, and that sets an opacity on my color automatically just in line here. Now if I save this and come over this way and hover over it, you can see that that color changes. Now next, let's actually come over here and add our icon. So I'm going to come to Phosphor icons, which are the icons I used for this project, and we'll search for a map. And I want this to actually be bold. So let's grab that as the dropdown. I'll click on here, and then what I can do is just copy the SVG directly. So below this span, I'm going to actually just paste in that SVG. Now I'm going to change a couple of things about this SVG by default. Let's first of all grab all of these right here. So I can grab the first one, and because this is the only thing I know that has this, if I hit Command-Shift-L, it'll select all those in the document. I'll change this to current color, which means as I change the color of the text, this SVG will just update automatically. So it saves me a couple small steps. Next, I actually do want to change the width here to just a width of 24, and I'll set the height to 24 as well. Now let's jump back over here and look at this, and there it is, perfect. That's what I want it to look like. Now in order to get that to lay out correctly, I will need to add a couple of more classes to the actual button itself. So back up in the link tag, let's go ahead and add a flex, and then we'll say that this needs to be space X2. So because flex gap hasn't been super well supported until really recently, adding this as space X does kind of that margin trick where it spaces it out and essentially lets the parent control the spacing of its children. If you're interested more in how Tailwind does that, you can look it up in the docs. Now, I mentioned earlier that we've got some kind of hard to read text here, especially here, and then I actually want this to have a little drop shadow as well, just to make it stand off from that background, especially once we get that parallax scrolling effect. So what I'm going to do is hit Command-P and search for my Tailwind config, and we're going to add one more custom class in here. So perhaps let's scroll up here, and let's just do it below the colors here. Again, Control and Spacebar lets me access this, and what I want is drop shadows. And there it is, drop shadow right there. And now I can just go ahead and add this in. Let's make sure we add a comma there though. Now if I move over here, let's look at the drop shadow docs. So drop shadow, there we go. And they give you lots of different options, small, but these are all obviously blurred a lot. That's kind of the point of a lot of these drop shadows. However, what I want to do is not add kind of a blurred effect, but a real hard drop shadow. So I'm going to go ahead and add in my own custom drop shadows right here, and we'll have text small, and basically what I'm doing is saying 1 pixel to the right, 1 pixel down, and then nearly 100% opacity. Same thing here, except for medium will be 2 and large will be 4. So I'm going to save that and jump back over this way and open back up this Feet app. And let's kind of adjust this by adding a couple different classes here. So first of all, let me come up here and right here, I'll add that custom class we created. So drop shadow, and not small, but actually text small like that. All right, so there you can see it right there, just barely 1 pixel over to the right and bottom. Now what I'm going to do is actually increase this as we get to larger sizes. So let's go when we get to large, we want this to be a drop shadow text, and in this case I actually want it to be my large. So now it should be quite a bit bigger when I pull out and get a little bit larger here, right there. So you can see it snaps in and it's bigger there. Now you can make it dynamic as well by making those M units, but I'm also going to use it here and in a couple other places, so I think I'll just switch between them as I get larger. So let me come up here, and let's see, right here we'll do the exact same thing. So say drop shadow, and in this case I want text, and I'll just leave it on small no matter what. So there we go. Now let's come down to our button down below, and I'm going to do the same thing here. So we'll say drop shadow text, and I'll do a large. The only difference here is on hover, I want my drop shadow to go down to none, which is 0. So as I come here, I should be able to come here and it kind of fades away. And maybe we should add a transition on this as well. So let's say transition, and we'll say shadow. Now when I come over here, it should kind of fade on and off. I don't know if you can see that quite yet, but once we get this parallax effect, you should be able to see that. Hey there, Chris from the future here. There's one more thing you might want to add in here, and that would be items center as another class. Later on, I actually increased the font to the entire web page, and when I do that, it actually knocks this out of alignment with the icon. So if that drives you insane, that's what's going on there. I'll make sure to update the code going forward, but just so you know, you might want to add that in. There's one other thing we can do to make this a little bit easier to read, and that is that we can add essentially like a transparent background here that goes from a green color, that accent color, down to transparent, and then at the bottom we could add something that goes from this dark color to transparent. So that will add kind of a backdrop over the top of that image. So let's go ahead and go to the top of the header section right here, and we made this relative so that we can position things like this image and these two divs we're about to do as position absolute. So I'll come in here and just do a dot, and let's add some more classes in here as well. So you can add a background gradient in Tailwind like this, and then you just give it a direction. So we'll go to bottom. So we're going to do that top one first, the accent one. We'll say it needs to be inset 0, so top, right, left, and bottom 0, and then we'll override the bottom to something like 3/4. And then we'll give it two color values. The first is where it starts, so from accent. And if I save it there, you see it starts up top there, and then to transparent, which it should kind of default to that anyhow, but I'll go ahead and add that there. Let's go ahead and copy this down. We've got one more to add. In this case, we're going to go not to bottom, but to top. And let's see, let's change around this bottom here as well. We're going to actually do a negative value here, and we're going to give it the number 32. And then in this case, we're going to go back around just like that, and we'll go 80% opacity, and we'll go then to transparent. And then we'll add one more thing here. We'll say the top needs to be at 1/3. In other words, it won't go quite as much to the top so that the screen still shines through. And now you can see that's a little bit easier to see, and if I come in here and hover, you can see that shadow disappear a little bit more easily, but it will especially once it moves over that top section. All right, so we're going to call that mostly done for the header. I think we're done with everything except for the parallax effect that we'll add in a later video. I'm going to come down here, though, below the header and inside our div that's going to hold everything in the document, I'm going to add a main tag. The rest of our content will stay in this landmark region, and that way this is declared as kind of the main content on the page. I'm going to add a class to this, though, and we'll have this be relative because we're going to have some things positioned to absolute inside of here. And then I do want to add a margin top of 16, which is for rem. And then as we get to bigger screen sizes, I'll actually increase this margin. So the easiest way to do that is just to declare these media queries. So I'll say margin top needs to be 24, and then on large, margin top needs to be 40. And then let's go ahead and add a padding bottom. This will be 16. This has to do with how everything is fading in. But essentially, as things are going to fade in later on in a project, we want to basically offset the bottom padding so that it doesn't look like it's getting cut off as it's fading up. So to do that, we're going to have a padding bottom of 16 and then a negative margin bottom of 16. So we're basically offsetting those, but it allows us to have padding on the bottom so it'll scale up nicely without looking cut off. Next, I'm going to have a grid, so everything inside the main section is going to be in one parent grid, and then we'll do a gap of 16 by default, which is for rem. And then again, as we get to larger screen sizes, we will change this. So to 24, and then on large screen sizes to 40. Finally, I do want another overflow hidden here, just to make sure that anything doesn't bleed out of this section, like that slider we're going to build in the next video. So those default classes are set up. Let's go ahead and add a section tag now, and this will be where we hold the next little section that has just the text that goes right here. In fact, let's jump back over here just so we can see that, and here it is right here. This is what dreams are made of. In fact, let's go ahead and add these to our clipboard like this, and I've got a clipboard manager which is called Pastebot, but there's lots of them like this where you can add some kind of sequential paste. Now I'm going to come in here and I can paste those back in the exact same order. Now we'll go ahead and have the top two sections here within a div, and the first one will be in a small tag, and I'm just going to go ahead and copy it in just like that. In fact, we don't need it to be capitalized because we'll do that in CSS, so we'll change that in just a second. And then I want this next one to be inside of an H2. Since I've already got an H1 up top, this is now the next section title for this section. And then finally below, let's see, below this div itself, so that we can space that out a little bit differently, I'll add a paragraph tag, and we'll add in all of that text. All right, cool. Let's come up here and let me go ahead and make this normal. And before we do too much more, let's go ahead and add a couple other things to the actual section that's holding all of this. So first of all, I'll have aria labeled by. We're going to point this to an ID of that H2, which we'll just call headline. And let me come in here and let's add that. So this will be a headline. This basically tells the browser that these are linked together, and this is what describes this section. Next, we did so much customization in that first video on the container. Let's go ahead and use it. So we got this container. It will keep everything in the middle and give us some default padding as well. And then we do want this to be a grid parent with a gap of 4 and text of center. And then we want to set a max width here. And they have this nice thing for prose, which basically makes for nice reading line length so it doesn't go too long. As you read it, it will wrap at a nice length of 65 characters. All right, so let me save that and move back to our app over this way. And I'm not seeing that, but I think it's actually because of this body overflow. So we do eventually need to add this. Let me come all the way back up top, this overflow hidden for the body. This needs to be there so that everything inside this Parallax ID can work properly. But in order for us to actually scroll right now, I actually need that off. And there we go. Okay, cool. Let's come in here to our small tag, and I'm going to add a couple classes here. First of all, I want the tracking. This would be like the letter spacing to be at my widest. So I'll go ahead and do that. And then I do want this text to take on the accent color rather than the default white color. I want it to be uppercase, and I'm going to add that drop shadow back in. So we'll do drop shadow text, and I want this to be small, just enough to where when that parallax effect starts to happen, I get just a little bit of a background on that text. Let's come down here now to the H2. I'm going to add some classes here, and we'll have text 3XL, font bold, and then tracking wide. And then we'll do our drop shadow text, and in this case, we'll do medium. Finally, for this section, let's come down to this paragraph. We'll give this a class of text muted, so we're going to change the color from our default white to that just kind of muted color, and then we'll say drop shadow, and you get the drill at this point, text, and we'll do small. And again, as we do that parallax effect and we get an image that ends up pulling behind this text, that backdrop will be really important. All right, let's come back up top and change one more thing, and then we're going to call this video good. Right now, this is pointing to favicon.svg, which is the default that comes with Vite. Let's go ahead and change this, though. Let's point it to our images, and we'll point it to our logo mark.svg. So if I refresh that, now I do get this nice text right here. Let's also then change the title. We'll just call this something like Traverse Landing Page, which is the name of this fake brand that we have created. All right, so there we go. We've got the header, and we've got this section just to make sure everything is working properly. As I expand this out, everything should stay in the center here, which is what I want. And all this should expand. The text should actually be dynamic, and it is doing that. That backdrop gets a little bit larger on these larger screen sizes just to make sure it really pops off that page. But all that looks great. And you can see here already that that drop shadow shows a little bit better on larger screen sizes when you can see the image behind it. All right, cool. So next time what we're going to do is work on this slider that shows up down this way. This actually presents some interesting UX UI challenges because what we're wanting to do is no matter the screen size, whether it's small like this, where as you click, you finally get to the last one, and you can obviously tell that it's the only thing on the page. But when you get to larger screen sizes, as you start clicking, you might only click 2 or 3 times, and then all images are showing already. And at that point, you want the right arrow to be disabled. We're going to solve this challenge with something called intersection observers with just plain old vanilla JavaScript. All right, I will catch you in the next video. Thanks so much for watching, and happy coding.